In a country that cheered for men who carried bombs and shouted fiery slogans, one thin, soft-spoken young man did something far more dangerous. He picked up a book, fell in love with silence, and decided to fight an empire with nothing but faith and bare feet. The strangest part? He had less than 24 hours to decide whether to throw away a secure future and step into a life that could end in prison or in complete obscurity. Midnight, early 1916. In a cramped room in the holy city of Varanasi, a young student named Vinayak Narahari Bhave sits cross-legged on the floor, a flickering, oil lamp painting shadows on the walls. In front of him lie two objects. On one side, a neatly folded certificate from the prestigious college he has just abandoned. Promise of a respectable career, salary, status, everything his father ever wanted for him. On the other side, a crumpled newspaper with a single article underlined until the paper is almost torn. A report about a man in Gujarat, a strange lawyer who has given up his profession, spun his own clothes, and is calling for a new kind of rebellion, without violence, without hatred, armed only with something called satyagraha. Next to that newspaper lies a letter, short, polite, signed Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. Gandhi has invited him to come to his ashram in Sabarmati. The last train he can catch leaves in a matter of hours. Outside, the city hums with the sounds of temple bells and distant conch shells. Inside, the silence is deafening. If he goes, he may never come back to a normal life. If he stays, he will betray the voice that has been growing louder inside his chest since childhood. This is the moment where the life of Vinoba Bhave, the man who would one day walk from village to village, asking landlords to give away their land peacefully, balances on the edge of a decision. But to understand how he got here, we have to go back to a hot, dusty village on the Konkan coast, where a boy learned that the deepest revolutions begin not with anger, but with an almost unbearable tenderness. He was born in 1895 in a small village that seemed to cling to the earth like a prayer. The monsoon clouds would roll in from the Arabian Sea, break over the red soil, and turn everything into streams and puddles. Children would splash barefoot through the mud, chasing each other, shouting. But little Vinayak was often somewhere else, on the veranda, watching the rain in silence, or curled up beside his mother, listening to stories of saints who owned nothing and feared nothing. His father was a government official, precise, disciplined, a man who knew the value of a job and a salary. He believed in education as a ladder out of poverty, out of uncertainty. In his mind, he could already see his son as a respected officer, perhaps in a British office, with polished shoes and a tidy desk. His mother, Rukmini, believed in something different. She believed in devotion. Her world was made of chants and lamps, fasts and festivals, the shimmering, invisible presence of God in every small act of kindness. She would wake before dawn, light a lamp, and her lips would move in silent prayer while everyone else still slept. Between these two worlds, discipline and devotion, Vinayak grew up. And early on it became clear, this boy was not like the others. Where other children fought over sweets, he would quietly give his share to someone else. Where they mocked the old and the weak, he would stand awkwardly between them, unsure how to fight but unable to walk away. Once during a village fair, he saw an old beggar being shoved aside. The man fell, his bowl scattering a few coins in the dust. Vinayak, barely tall enough to see over the crowd, pushed his way forward, knelt down, and started picking up the coins one by one. The crowd laughed. Someone shouted, "Look at the little saint." He didn't answer. He just kept picking up the coins, his small fingers trembling. For his father, such moments were amusing, even touching, but they also seemed dangerous. "The world is not run on charity," he would say. "You must be strong. You must stand on your own feet." Vinayak heard him. He tried. He went to school, sat in the wooden benches, stared at blackboards filled with English words that tasted like dust in his mouth. He scored well because his mind was sharp and restless, but the success felt hollow. The subjects that caught fire in his imagination were not geometry or commerce. They were Sanskrit, religious texts, the words of the Bhagavad Gita that spoke of duty, detachment, and a mysterious path of action without desire. At night, when the house was quiet, he would light a lamp and open the Gita. The paper was thin. The letters danced in the wavering light. The world outside shrank to the whisper of pages turning. He felt as if someone centuries away was talking directly to him. "Do your work, but do not cling to the fruits. Be fearless, see God in all. As he grew older, the outside world started to intrude more violently. Posters of the British King and Queen stared down from government offices. Taxes fell like a hammer on the poorest farmers. Rumors of protests and crackdowns floated even into the remotest villages. Names like Tilak and Lokmanya were spoken in low tones. Sometimes at the market, someone would unfold a banned pamphlet, eyes scanning the words before hurriedly tucking it away. Within this tension, another kind of rivalry began to appear. A rivalry not between two people, but between two visions of what a young Indian like Vinayak could become. On one side, the model his father admired. The clever student, polished, fluent in English, working with or within the system, climbing the ladder, secure, respectable, the kind of man families pointed to with pride. On the other side, a rising figure in the national imagination, the fiery revolutionary. Young men slipping away at night, hands blackened with gunpowder, whispering of bomb factories and secret meetings. They were the ones people spoke of in hushed, admiring tones. He is ready to die for the country. Between these two poles, Vinayak felt tugged and stretched. Both paths, in their own way, promised power. But something in him pulled in a third direction altogether, toward a life that did not fit neatly into either frame. For a while, he tried to follow the predictable path. He moved to a bigger town to continue his education, passed exams, saw his name posted on notice boards. Teachers praised him. Letters went back to his family, filled with quiet pride. But inside, a storm was gathering. One moment crystallized it. In a classroom, a British professor delivered a polished lecture on the civilizing mission of the empire. He spoke of railways, of law and order, of the backwardness of Indian customs. A few students nodded, eager to please. The professor's voice rose. Without us, you would still be living in darkness. Something snapped. Vinayak felt a heat rising to his face. In his mind, the dusty fields of his village flashed before him, his mother's lamp before dawn, the songs that had shaped his heart. Darkness. Who had the right to call that life darkness? He didn't stand up and argue. That was not his way. Instead, he did something more radical, more silent. He turned inward and made a promise to himself. I will not seek knowledge that teaches me to despise my own people. Soon after, he made the decision that would terrify his family. He left formal education, walked away from the career track everyone assumed he would follow. Without drama, without slogans, he slipped out of the river of expectations and turned toward a different current. Varanasi, the ancient city on the Ganges, the place where seekers had gone for centuries in search of something deeper than degrees and jobs. There, in the cramped lanes and crowded ghats, surrounded by the smoke of cremation fires and the chant of priests, he buried himself in Sanskrit and scripture. It was here, in a tiny room that smelled of ink and oil, that the Gita became not just a book, but a living voice, his constant companion. But while he immersed himself in timeless verses, the clock of history was ticking loudly. Across India, the freedom movement was sharpening. Newspapers carried accounts of protests, of arrests, of speeches that set hearts on fire. One name kept recurring now with growing insistence: Gandhi. First, it was just a whisper. Stories of a strange man in South Africa who had fought injustice without lifting a weapon. Then articles about his return to India, his spinning wheel, his defiance, his insistence that real strength did not lie in guns but in willingness to suffer. To many ambitious young men, Gandhi was a confusing figure. He did not promise quick glory or heroic martyrdom. He spoke instead of discipline, of fasting, of cleaning latrines with one's own hands. In the nationalist imagination, he stood as a competitor to the more glamorous image of the gun-wielding revolutionary. For Vinayak, that clash between images was not theoretical. He could feel it around him. In tea stalls and dormitory rooms, boys his age argued, "If we don't fight back, they'll crush us forever." Gandhi says suffering is stronger than bullets. You'll die with a lathi in your hand while they laugh at you. At least I won't become like them. These debates didn't stay abstract. They sliced through friendships, created factions, shaped destinies. In that tense atmosphere, a kind of rivalry emerged between two invisible mentors. On one side, the imagined figure of the revolutionary, leader, fierce and uncompromising. On the other, the slowly forming presence of Gandhi, with his bare feet and unsettling moral demands. It was in this air that the newspaper arrived. One winter day in Varanasi, Vinayak picked up a copy and his eyes fell on a report of Gandhi's speech in the city. The words on the page burned. Gandhi had spoken not only of throwing off British rule, but of cleaning the rot within Indian society itself, of untouchability, of caste, of hypocrisy. For Vinayak, it was like hearing the Gita echo in a human voice. He read the article again and again until the letters blurred. He imagined this man wearing coarse khadi, standing calmly before a crowd, refusing to hate even as he resisted, and something in him leaped. For years he had felt like an outsider, too spiritual for the world of politics, too restless for the quiet world of renunciation. Now before him appeared a path that seemed to weave both together, action rooted in inner discipline, politics as an expression of spiritual truth. That night he sat with pen and paper and wrote a letter, simple, direct. He introduced himself, spoke of his studies, of his love for the Gita, of his longing to serve the country in a way that did not destroy his soul. He sent the letter, not knowing if it would be read, much less answered. Days turned into weeks. Life went on. He kept studying, kept walking the Ghats. Then one day the reply came. The envelope was plain, the handwriting compact. The letter was short, but to Vinayak the words glowed. Gandhi invited him to come to his ashram in Sabarmati, to live, to learn, to serve. It was not a job offer. There was no salary, no clear future, no guarantee of safety. It was, in essence, an invitation to step off the map entirely, and that's how we returned to that small room in Varanasi, to the flickering lamp, the folded certificate, the crumpled newspaper, the letter. The time pressure was not just about the train schedule, it was about something much larger. Outside, the British Raj was tightening its grip, but the resistance was also gathering strength. The coming years would be decisive. If he chose the ashram, he would be throwing his life into the furnace of a movement whose outcome no one could predict. Meanwhile, in the minds of parents and relatives far away, the competition was crystal clear. Somewhere out there, boys just like him, maybe even from neighboring villages, were already climbing the ladders of government service, or building reputations as leaders in town councils, or joining bold underground groups that would one day be remembered as martyrs. Vinayak, in that room, could almost feel their presence. The ambitious civil servant with his English suit, the fiery revolutionary with his clenched fist, both calling out to him, "Choose my way. Mine changes the world. Mine is real." Between them, the invitation from Gandhi lay like a quiet third path, demanding more, promising less. His father's imagined voice echoed, "Think of your future." His mother's whispered prayers rose, "Think of your soul." The lamp sputtered. Outside, somewhere in the darkness, a train whistle screamed, faint, distant, but real. He had to decide. He picked up the certificate first. The paper felt stiff, official. Years of effort, expectations, comparisons were folded into that single object. If he kept it, he always had a way back. A job, respectability, a place in the world as it was. Then he lifted the letter from Gandhi, almost weightless, yet his hand shook as if holding something heavy. He closed his eyes. Images cascaded. His mother's face, the old beggar's scattered coins, the professor's arrogant words, the Gita's verses of fearlessness, the wounded pride of a land called backward by its rulers, the rising smoke of village cook fires all over India. He opened his eyes and exhaled. What he did next would set him on a journey that would take him through prisons and villages, through hunger and adoration, through loneliness and the love of millions. A journey that decades later would see him knocking gently at the doors of powerful landlords, asking them to give away what they owned, not to the government, not under threat, but freely to the landless poor. But for now, all of that lay in a future he could not see. There was only a young man, a ticking clock, and a choice between the known and the terrifyingly unknown. He stood up, folded the certificate once more, not with contempt, but with a kind of tenderness, as if saying goodbye to a life that might have been. He placed it carefully in his small trunk, not as a talisman of security, but as a relic of a road he was turning away from. Then he took Gandhi's letter, pressed it to his forehead in silent respect, and slipped it into the pocket of his kurta. By the time the first light of dawn touched the river, Vinayak Narahari Bhav was walking toward the railway station with a small bundle of clothes and a heart that beat faster with every step. He did not know that one day people would call him Acharya, teacher. He did not know that he would become a moral competitor not to any one man, but to an entire political culture built on power and fear. He only knew that somewhere a man named Gandhi was building an ashram, and that if he did not reach the train on time, he might spend the rest of his life wondering what would have happened if he had gone. The station was already coming to life. Vendors shouting, porters weaving through the crowd, steam hissing from the waiting engine. He bought a ticket with the few coins he had. As he stepped onto the platform, a strange calm settled over him. The path ahead would not be easy. He would soon discover that even inside Gandhi's circle, there were hierarchies, tensions, rivalries between those who saw the movement as a stepping stone to power and those who wanted something purer, more difficult. He would find himself again and again pulled into silent competition with another type of leader, the politician who sought office, the activist who sought headlines, the speaker who sought applause. But that was still to come. Right now, as the whistle blew and the train jerked into motion, carrying him towards Sabarmati, the boy from a coastal village closed his eyes and whispered a verse from the Gita under his breath. Action without desire, courage without hatred, love without fear. The world he was entering did not yet know his name. But the quiet revolution that would one day make him Vinoba Bhave had just begun to move, like a train leaving its station, gathering speed. When the train screeched into Ahmedabad, Vinayak expected to see the front line of a revolution. Instead, the first thing he was handed was a broom. Dust swirled in the courtyard of Sabarmati Ashram. A few mud huts, a prayer ground, a cowshed. No marching bands, no slogans, no banners, just the smell of earth and cow dung, and a thin man in a simple dhoti squinting at the new arrivals. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi did not look like the rival of an empire. His ribs showed. His glasses sat crooked on his nose. Yet when his eyes rested on Vinayak, it felt like being seen through, cell by cell. "So," Gandhi said softly, "you've left college." It wasn't a question, it was a diagnosis. Vinayak bowed his head. He had rehearsed a dozen speeches on patriotism and sacrifice. None of them came out. Gandhi smiled faintly. "Good. Then we can begin with cleaning the latrines." Around them, other young men shifted uncomfortably. One of them, a confident, sharp-featured student from Bombay who had arrived on the same train, whispered, half amused, half disgusted, "I came to fight the British, not to scrub toilets." There it was from the very first hour, the invisible line dividing the ashram. On one side, those who saw this place as a training ground for future leaders, ministers, negotiators, men whose names would go into history books. On the other, those like Vinayak, who had come without any clear ambition except to obey whatever truth demanded, however humiliating it looked. Gandhi's experiment did something cruel to ego. It refused to feed it. They all woke before dawn to the clang of a bell. They spun cotton on the charkha until their fingers ached. They farmed, cooked, washed their own clothes, taught children from nearby villages. Everyone, no matter how educated, took turns cleaning the ashram toilets. It was here that Vinayak began to disappear and Vinoba began to be born. Someone, perhaps Gandhi himself, perhaps an ashram mate, softened his name. Vinoba rolled more gently off the tongue, like a river smoothing a stone. Bit by bit, the old life, the old image of success wore away. But this new life came with its own kind of competition. The young man from Bombay, let's call him the orator, because he was born for platforms, quickly found his place. He spoke English fluently, quoted European thinkers, could talk for an hour and leave a crowd roaring. When visiting leaders came to Sabarmati, he was always at the front, eager to translate, to impress. Vinoba did the opposite. He sought the quietest corners, the library, the cowshed, the fields at dusk. Where the orator reached outward, Vinoba reached inward, filling himself with Sanskrit texts, with the Gita, with Gandhi's strange, severe interpretation of what it meant to live truthfully. Yet even in silence, rivalry seeped in. Non-cooperation was building like a storm. Across India, protests, strikes, and boycotts ignited. Everyone sensed that the British would soon strike harder. Young men jostled, not only for the chance to serve, but also for the chance to be seen serving. With every new campaign, Gandhi announced, a tense, unspoken question moved through the ashram. Who will he choose? One evening, under a sky washed purple by the setting sun, Gandhi called a small group together, Vinoba among them. The air felt electric. A rumor had spread. He was planning a nationwide agitation, something bigger than anything before. The struggle ahead, Gandhi said quietly, will not be won by anger, but by those who are ready to go to prison as easily as to sleep. There was a pause. The orator stepped forward. "Bapu, send me. I am ready." His words hung in the air, bold and perfectly timed, like a political slogan. Gandhi turned instead to the thin, almost shy figure standing slightly behind the others. "And you, Vinoba, are you ready?" Vinoba's reply was different. No speech, no flourish. Just a simple, steady, "If it is God's will through you, I will go." Gandhi's eyes narrowed as if weighing not the words but the space around them. Years later, people would ask, when did Gandhi really begin to trust Vinoba? You could point to many moments, but this one was crucial, not because of what Vinoba said, but because of what he didn't need to claim. Soon, the first great test arrived. In Nagpur in 1923, a tide of nationalist passion was surging around a single symbol, the Indian flag. The British forbade its hoisting in public. To raise it was to invite arrest. To lower it under pressure was to break the spirit of thousands watching. Gandhi needed someone to go there, hold that flag, and refuse to let it fall, no matter what. Many in the movement expected a big name, a famous orator, a rising politician, someone whose arrest would cause headlines and outrage. Gandhi chose instead the quiet scholar from Sabarmati, Vinoba. The decision hit the inner circle like a shock. The orator, now deeply networked in Congress circles, could hardly hide his frustration. "Bapu," he said later, attempting to keep his voice respectful. "With respect, how will sending an unknown person help the cause? The British fear names, prestige. They must see that their actions have consequences." Gandhi replied with a sentence that would sting for years. "The British fear conscience more than reputation. Vinoba carries that." Time was running fast in Nagpur. The British had set a clear threat: raise the flag, get crushed. Local leaders pleaded for guidance. Postponements, compromises, partial climbs, it would all be read as weakness. Vinoba arrived with barely days to calm a crowd bristling with anger, with leaders divided, with informers watching. He had a narrow window to do something almost impossible: turn raw passion into disciplined courage. He did not begin with a fiery speech. He began with prayer. On the day set for the flag hoisting, thousands gathered, hearts hammering. Police lathis gleamed in the harsh sun. The flagpole stood like a challenge in the middle of the square. Vinoba walked toward it barefoot, each step deliberate, as if he were entering a temple instead of a battlefield. He took the flag in his hands, a piece of cloth that now felt like the entire weight of a nation, and began to climb. Shouts erupted. Some in the crowd screamed with joy. Others urged caution. A British officer barked orders. Lathis rose. A single blow could knock him off. A single flinch could crack the courage of everyone watching. He did not flinch. He tied the flag, pulled the rope, watched it rise against the brutal blue of the sky, and then he stayed there, hands on the mast, eyes fixed on the cloth as if daring the empire itself to come and lower it. The Lathis fell. He was dragged down, beaten, arrested. Blood stained his dhoti, but the flag remained up. News of the unknown ascetic who defied the ban spread like wildfire. In jail, as days turned into months, then years, Vinoba's resolve hardened. Official records would later list the arrest dryly, another line in a long list of political prisoners. For those who were there, it was something else. The first clear sign that beneath the quiet of Vinoba's exterior there burned a steel as hard as any revolutionary's. Back in the wider movement, the competition changed shape. The orator gained influence in Congress committees, learning the art of negotiations, of resolutions, of balancing demands. Vinoba, in and out of prison, gained something less visible: moral weight. When he returned, Gandhi did not place him on stages. He sent him instead to the villages of central India, to Wardha and the surrounding region, to build what many politicians considered a sideshow: constructive work, spinning, literacy, village sanitation, removal of untouchability. It sounded dull compared to the drama of protests and jail, but in those dusty villages something radical was happening. Time became Vinoba's harshest rival. In each village he might have only a day, sometimes only a few hours before moving on. A meeting at dusk, a prayer at dawn, then the bullock cart would be ready, creaking toward the next cluster of huts. How much could he change in one night? What could he plant in a few conversations that wouldn't die the moment he left? While others chased laws and seats, he chased hearts and habits. He spoke not of overthrowing rulers, but of overthrowing the tyrant within: greed, caste pride, fear. He argued with landlords about wages and justice. He sat outside temples with those considered untouchable, refusing to enter unless they were allowed in too. He taught children letters under trees, using sticks and dust as his blackboard. He was not winning elections. He was doing something stranger, quietly building the inner soil of a future country. But politics, like a jealous competitor, refused to stay away. By the late 1930s and early 1940s, a new struggle loomed. The Second World War had broken out. The British dragged India into it without consent. Gandhi prepared a new kind of protest. Not mass movement this time, but individual satyagraha. One by one, chosen satyagrahis would step forward, publicly declare opposition to war, and calmly submit to arrest. Again, the question ripped through the movement: whom will he choose first? Senior Congress leaders, Nehru, Patel, Rajendra Prasad, were all towering figures by now. Many assumed one of them would lead the way. The orator, no longer merely a promising youth but a recognized regional leader, campaigned quietly among his peers. The first satyagrahi must be a political figure, someone whose arrest forces the British to bargain, someone whose name shakes the press. Gandhi thought otherwise. In October 1940, he stunned the political world by announcing his choice for the first individual satyagrahi, Vinoba Bhave, the ascetic. Worker from Wardha, little known to the general public. The backlash was immediate, if mostly whispered. Why him? He's not even on the working committee. This is spiritual favoritism. The country needs political strategy, not saintliness. Even the orator, meeting Gandhi in private, could not contain his frustration. Bapu, he insisted, with immense respect, this is a waste of opportunity. The British will be relieved to arrest a man who is not central to negotiations. Gandhi's reply was blunt, almost cutting. You measure by headlines? I measure by the capacity to suffer without hatred. For this satyagraha, Vinoba is the strongest man I know. There was no time for Vinoba to adjust to his new role. Within days of the announcement, he had to step into the arena. On a chilly November morning in the town of Paunar, he stood before a modest gathering. No grand stage, no microphones. Just a few hundred villagers, some policemen, and the enormous moral weight of being the first. He had a simple mission: to speak a sentence declaring his opposition to India's participation in the war without consent, and then to accept the consequences without resistance. He did not shout. He spoke in a calm, almost conversational tone. Yet every word seemed to land with the force of a hammer. We cannot wish victory to a war that insults human dignity, he said. Our loyalty is to truth, not to empires built on it. The magistrate stepped forward, voice stiff. Do you withdraw your statement? The time pressure in that instant was like a vice. To withdraw meant humiliation, not just personally, but for the entire path of nonviolence. To persist meant prison, beatings, perhaps worse. The eyes of the whole movement, friend and rival alike, were on him. He folded his hands. No, I stand by it. The chains clicked shut around his wrists. As he was led away, one of the policemen, unable to resist, muttered, Why ruin your life for words? Men in Delhi will make deals no matter what you do. Vinoba turned, his face soft. If we do not speak the truth while we still can, one day there will be no words left that are not lies. He spent months behind bars, part of the long procession of satyagrahis whose bodies filled British prisons like a slow, steady flood. In the silence of the cell, he returned to his old companion, the Bhagavad Gita. He began to give talks on it to fellow prisoners, simple, direct interpretations that linked its verses not to heavenly realms, but to the struggle of living truthfully under tyranny. Those talks would echo far beyond the prison walls. After his release, recordings of his Gita discourses, carried later by radio and word of mouth, would turn him into something India had not had for centuries. A modern saint whose battlefield was not mythology, but politics, poverty, and social conflict. Then Gandhi was killed. The bullet that tore through Gandhi's chest in January 1948 did more than end a life. It tore open a vacuum. Into that empty space surged a different kind of competition, the scramble for control of a newborn nation. Within days, some voices began to whisper, who will be Gandhi's heir? The obvious answers were political. Nehru, now Prime Minister, Patel, the iron unifier of the princely states. But there was another, quieter possibility, felt by those who had seen Gandhi's inner world up close. Vinoba. Offers began to arrive, wrapped in soft words and hard expectations. Acharya, party workers said, using the title teacher that had begun to cling to him. You must guide the government, contest elections, take a seat in parliament. If men like you stay outside, the field is left to the ambitious, eh? It was the old rivalry, now raised to the level of a whole country. The path of power versus the path of conscience. The orator, by now an MP with a bulging public schedule, came to meet him in Ward Hall. Their conversation was sharply polite. You could do immense good from inside the state, the orator pressed. From the outside, you will become a beautiful story, but a powerless one. Vinoba listened, eyes lowered, fingers rolling a strand of spun cotton. I am not called to become power, he answered quietly. I am called to become pressure, on myself first, on society next. If I enter politics, I will spend my life guarding a chair. I prefer walking. It sounded poetic. It was also terrifyingly impractical. India was locking itself into 5-year plans, ministries, law codes. Steel plants and dams became the new temples. In that steel and concrete race, a barefoot man talking about inner change looked almost irrelevant. But beneath the surface, the problems that had haunted Vinoba since childhood were mutating. Landlessness, caste humiliation, structural violence. In places like the Telangana region, they were exploding into open rebellion. Peasants driven by hunger and rage took up arms. Landlords answered with private militias. The government, young and insecure, leaned toward the most familiar tool of all states under threat, force. Time was closing in again, this time not on one man, but on millions. Each clash between police and peasants, each ambush, each burning hut, pushed the country closer to a choice, crush the uprising with bullets and declare order, or listen to the rage underneath and risk undermining the very property structures on which the new India was built. In Delhi, men like the orator argued passionately for firmness. If we permit lawlessness in Telangana, he thundered in Parliament, the whole nation will burn. We cannot let sentimentality paralyze the state. Far away in the stillness of Paunar Ashram near Wardha, Vinoba heard about Telangana in scraps. A torn newspaper, a worried visitor, a story, a letter from a Congress worker begging him to come. One evening, as the sun sank behind the low hills and the ashram bell called for evening prayers, he sat alone, the Gita open before him but unread. For once the verses did not soothe, they accused. If nonviolence cannot touch this fire, he thought, then all our spinning and fasting have been a performance. A messenger arrived breathless from Hyderabad state, a local Congress worker with dust in his hair and desperation in his eyes. Acharya, he said, if you come, maybe some bloodshed can be avoided. But the situation is worsening every day. If you delay even by a month, there will be nothing left but ashes. There it was again, the ticking clock. On one side, the steady, promising path of a life in the ashram, teaching, studying, being revered as a saint while the nation went on its chosen course. On the other, a journey straight into the heart of a region where the gun, not the rosary, set the tempo. He had faced such a fork once before, in a narrow room in Varanasi with a train to catch. Now the stakes were larger. The competitor wasn't just a brilliant orator or a tempting career. It was an entire political culture that believed deeply that real change flowed downward from offices and ministries, not upward, from villages and consciences. He looked at the calendar. The hot season was already pressing in. Within weeks, the monsoons would break over Telangana. Roads would turn to sludge. Travel would become nearly impossible. If he was to go, he had to go now. He closed the Gita gently as if tucking in a sleeping child and stood. Tell them, he said to the messenger, that I will start walking, not as a negotiator, not as a government envoy, not as a politician. I will come as a beggar, and we will see whether the human heart still has any land left in it to give. Outside, the first distant rumble of thunder rolled across the darkening sky, like a drumbeat counting down. He walked into a war zone with nothing in his hands but emptiness. No gun, no flag, no official letter from Delhi. Just bare feet, a walking stick, a thin cotton shawl, and a deadline set not by clocks but by gunshots. Every week he delayed, more bodies were falling in the fields of Telangana. Every month he spent in quiet Wardha, the new India in Parliament, men like the orator, hardened their argument. Violence, they said. I must be met by the state, not by wandering saints with begging bowls. So Vinoba began to walk. Dust rose around his feet like a small stubborn cloud. Behind him trudged a ragged band, a few companions, some village workers, a couple of scribbling journalists who weren't sure yet if this was a story or a sideshow. The Hyderabad region he entered was not the romantic India of spinning wheels and prayer songs. It was charred houses, bullet-pocked walls, men disappearing at night. Landlords armed their guards. Communist guerrillas hid in the hills, convinced that nothing changed without the barrel of a gun. Police patrols burned with the certainty that they alone were protecting order. In one village, as soon as he arrived, the headman pulled him aside. "Acharya, please leave before dark," he whispered. "If the guerrillas see you with us, they'll think you're on the state side. If the police see you talking to the peasants, they'll think you're on the rebel side. Here, neutrality is just another word for next to die." That was Vinoba's first real taste of the new freedom. You could be shot from both directions, in the name of two different kinds of justice. He stayed. That night, in a hut lit by a single smoky lamp, he sat between two groups who, for years, had only seen each other through gun sights. Landlords on one side, trembling but proud. Landless peasants on the other, gaunt and furious. The air was a fist. One careless phrase and the whole hut could explode. "Why have you come?" a communist organizer demanded. "To preach patience while we starve?" Vinoba looked at his face, eyes cracked red from sleeplessness, cheeks hollow. "I have not come to preach patience," he said quietly. "I have come to ask for something impossible." The landlord laughed bitterly. "Impossible is cheap, Acharya. The state asks us for taxes. The guerrillas ask us for land. What will you ask?" The answer, when it came, was so strange that later people would repeat it like a fable. "I will ask," Vinoba said, "for land as a gift." The word fell into the room like a stone into a dry well. Gift. In Telangana, land was blood. Men killed for a single acre. Families nursed grudges over boundary lines drawn before their great-grandfathers were born. To speak of land and gift in the same breath sounded insane. But insanity sometimes has its own logic. "If you give land under the gun," Vinoba told the peasants, "you will always fear that someone stronger will one day take it back by a bigger gun. If you keep all the land," he told the landlord, "you will sleep every night with one eye open, and your sons will live in fear. I have come," he said finally, "to beg you both for something, not as a government officer, not as a revolutionary, as a mendicant. Give me land that I can then give in your name to those who have none." The landlord shook his head. "No one gives land," he muttered. "Land is not coconut and flowers." Days passed. Villages came and went. Meetings blurred into one another. Courtyards filled with bodies. Huts packed to suffocation. Faces glowing in the lantern light. Hard with doubt. Time pressed on his shoulders. Each evening his companions would tell him, another clash in the next district, more arrests, more corpses. The state was running out of patience. If violence didn't calm down, a full-scale operation would sweep through, crushing rebels and innocents together. In Delhi, the orator spoke thunderously in the assembly. "We cannot govern by appealing to feudal charity," he declared. "We need laws, ceilings, enforcement. The age of moral lectures is over." Far away in a dusty village called Pochampally, Vinoba walked into a scene that would prove him wrong or prove him a fool. The village was ringed with low hills, the soil cracked, the sun a white hole hammered into the sky. Peasants there had a specific, desperate demand. They needed 80 acres to divide among the landless families who tilled others' fields from dawn to dusk. 80 acres, not a metaphor, not a symbol, a number. Vinoba listened, silent. Around him murmurs rose. The government will not help. The landlords will not yield. The communists say, "Seize it." The ticking of their hunger was louder than any clock. When they finished, he stood, his body swaying slightly from the day's heat and the endless miles behind him. "I cannot give you land," he said. "I own nothing, but there may be someone here whom God has made the guardian of more land than he needs. If such a person is here and hears God's whisper in his heart, let him come." Silence, then a shuffle. A man stepped forward, middle-aged, sharp-nosed, eyes restless. His name was Ramchandra Reddy, a landlord of the village. "How many acres do you need?" he asked, voice surprisingly steady. 80, a peasant answered. almost apologetically as if asking for the moon. Reddy nodded slowly. "I will give 100. The words seemed to rip the air open. For a few seconds no one moved. It was as if the entire village had forgotten how to breathe. Then noise, cries, some shouted praise. Some shouted suspicion. What is his trick? Where is the catch? One man stood weeping openly, palms to his eyes. In that instant something shifted. Not in law books, not in policy, but deep in the imagination of the crowd. A new wild thought took root. Land can move without blood. Later that night, under a sky salty with stars, Vinoba sat alone, knees pulled up, watching villagers talk in urgent clusters. Around him, his companions whispered in awe, 100 acres, Acharya, without a single blow. This is a miracle. Vinoba's answer was sober, almost cold. A miracle is only a door, he said. Now we must decide whether to walk through it or build a shrine at the threshold and stay outside forever. Because once a miracle happens, it sets a trap. You can treat it as an exception, a myth to be repeated, or you can treat it as a precedent. Vinoba chose the second. In Pochampali, he named what had just happened Bhudan, land gift. Not a one-time act of generosity, but in his vision the seed of a revolution waged not through confiscation or ballots, but through conscience. From that day in 1951, his entire life turned into a single long, almost inhuman race. Every dawn, walk. Every afternoon, talk. Every evening, persuade. 5 miles a day, 10, sometimes 20. Through Telangana's baked fields, through Orissa's forests, through the floodplains of Bihar, through the villages of Uttar Pradesh and Madhya Pradesh and beyond. He refused cars. He refused fixed schedules that privileged big towns over small hamlets. If a village had 10 houses, it still had a human soul. And a human soul, he insisted, could still be asked for the impossible. The numbers began to climb. 10,000 acres, 50,000, 100,000. Newspapers, at first skeptical, started using phrases like peaceful revolution, saint of the landless, India's walking conscience. Politicians grew nervous. In Parliament, the orator watched the reports with a tightening jaw. Voluntary donations, he sneered to a colleague in the corridor, are a soft substitute for justice. The landlords will give the worst land, the most remote, the disputed plots, and the government will wash its hands and say, the problem is solved. He wasn't entirely wrong, because with the fame came something darker, the vultures of prestige. In some districts, landlords competed to announce bigger and bigger land gifts publicly, to polish their image, to curry favor with government, to massage their own souls without surrendering real power. 100 acres promised here, 1,000 there. In one place, a Maharaja pledged 10,000 acres in a voice thick with piety. On paper, the Bhudan movement began to look titanic. Within a decade, over 4 million acres had been declared donated across India, an area larger than some countries. The figures dazzled the press. Foreign observers flew in to walk a few miles beside the frail man in homespun cloth who seemed to be redrawing property lines with nothing but words. But behind each statistic was a bitter question. How much of this land would actually reach the landless? The answer was a labyrinth of broken promises and bureaucratic knots. In some cases, the gifted land was rocky, uncultivable, or already under legal dispute. In others, the gift was made with fine print. Yes, I give, but when I die, or I give, but only if the law recognizes my ownership first. Village officials dragged their feet registering transfers. State governments differed in enthusiasm. Some saw Bhudan as a godsend, a way to diffuse rural anger without touching entrenched interests. Others saw it as a nuisance that complicated their carefully drafted land reform acts. Vinoba knew this. He could read the gap between what was being promised in public and what was being handed over in private. At night, in makeshift huts, he would go over lists, ask his team about follow-up. The answers were often painful. That landlord, Acharya, his relatives are contesting the deed. In that village, the Patwari refuses to enter the transfer in the records. He says he has no orders from above. The land given there is 13 miles from the village and full of stones. No one can farm it without money they do not have. He lay awake listening, the weight of every lie and half-truth pressing on his ribcage like a stone. Was he being used? Was his walking, his begging, his faith simply providing a moral alibi for a system skilled at swallowing revolutions and emitting ceremonies? Yet each time fatigue tempted him to stop, he would remember a pair of hands, cracked, trembling, landless, which had taken title papers for even 2 meager acres and touched them to the forehead as if they were holy scripture. For that family, the paper meant more than all the cynical analysis. Time, however, showed no mercy. By the late 1950s, Vinoba was in his 60s. His feet were torn, his health beginning to fray. India was charging into its self-declared development decade. Steel plants roaring, dams swallowing valleys, cities swelling with migrants. The language of the age was productivity, growth, targets. In that metallic vocabulary, the figure of a man limping from village to village asking landlords to part with land began to sound antique. The orator, now a cabinet minister, visited him once during a Bhutan march, descending from a polished car into a swirl of dust and barefoot bodies. They met in the shade of a banyan tree, the contrast between them almost theatrical. The minister in neatly pressed khadi, fountain, pen glinting in his pocket. Vinoba thin as a wire, dust coating his ankles. "I respect your sacrifice," the orator began, his tone smooth but edged. "But you must see, this cannot solve the agrarian crisis. We need bold legislative ceilings. As long as land is left to the goodwill of zamindars, we will chase illusions, then make strong laws," Vinoba replied. "Why do you need my permission for that?" The orator frowned. "Because your movement gives them cover. When we speak of compulsory redistribution, they point to you and say, 'See, the saint believes in voluntary gifts. You are used as a shield against us.' It was a brutal, uncomfortable truth. The saint and the minister, intended by destiny to work together, had become, in practice, each other's alibis and obstacles. "So what would you have me do?" Vinoba asked softly. "Sit in Warda and condemn you? Enter your parliament and play your games? I only know how to walk and to ask." "Ask for revolution," the orator shot back. "Not charity." For a flicker of a second, heat rose in Vinoba's eyes. "You think this is charity?" he said, voice suddenly harder. "Charity is when the rich give crumbs to feel holy. I am asking them to wound their own hearts, to tear off a limb. You can compel their hands by law. I am trying to compel their conscience. The country needs both surgeries." They parted with no handshake, only a small, stiff nod. That evening, as the sun bled into the fields, Vinoba addressed the villagers gathered around him. "I met your minister today," he told them. "He is my younger brother in this struggle. He works with laws, I work with love. But love without justice is sentimentality. Justice without love is cruelty. We must see how much of each our hearts can bear." The crowd listened, not quite understanding the political philosophy, but sensing the ache beneath the words. As the years wound on, he drove the movement into a deeper phase. It was not enough, he felt, to move individual plots like pebbles. The real revolution would be to transform the idea of ownership itself. Thus was born Gramdan, the gift of the village. In a Gramdan village, all land would be considered collectively owned by the community. Individual families would still cultivate specific plots, but ultimate authority over how land was used, bought or sold would rest with the village council. It was an attempt not just to balance rich and poor, but to rewrite the grammar of property into the language of trusteeship. It was an audacious escalation. If Putin had made landlords uneasy, Gramdan terrified them and puzzled many of his own allies. "Acharya," one Congress worker confessed, "ordinary people can understand giving a few acres to the poor, but when you say the whole village land belongs to everyone, they get frightened. It sounds like losing what little security they have." Vinoba smiled faintly. "We have spent centuries worshipping mine and thine," he replied. "I am only asking us to try ours for a while." The pace of his walking became almost inhuman. 13 years of continuous padyatra from 1951 to 1964. By one estimate, he covered over 40,000 kilometers, almost the circumference of the earth. He crossed rivers on fragile boats, forded streams up to his waist, climbed hills on paths where even mules slipped. He slept in temples, in schools, in half-ruined huts. He ate whatever was offered, coarse millet, watery dal, stale bread, refusing the slightest special treatment. There was a phrase he would repeat often: "My body is on lease from God. I will return it worn out." By the early 1960s, the numbers for Gramdan too looked staggering. Tens of thousands of villages were declared Gramdan villages. Maps were printed with whole districts shaded as if a moral tide had swept over them, transforming the old feudal landscape. But again, the same slow poison seeped in, paper promises outpacing lived reality. Some villagers agreed to Gramdan just to please visiting officials or secure small grants, then went back to buying and selling land as before. In some places, village elites captured the collective council and used it to tighten their control. In others, state laws did not know how to recognize or enforce Gramdan's new category of ownership, leaving everything in a limbo of good intentions and legal confusion. Rumors began to spread. Bhutan is a bluff. Gramdan is eyewash. He has been tricked. In the cities, younger radicals scoffed. While he walks and begs, they said in student meetings, the landlords are investing in factories and buying urban property. The game has moved on, and the saint is walking in an empty stadium. Show. Yet in village after village, when that frail figure appeared on the dusty road, children still ran ahead shouting, Acharya is coming. Women still emerged with brass pots of water. Old men still pressed their foreheads to his feet. In the smallest, most forgotten corners of the country, his words still had the power to rearrange decisions made in private silence at 3 a.m. One winter night, in a small village where the wind cut like a blade, a farmer came to him in tears. I promised you 3 acres last year, the man confessed, but I did not complete the papers. My family objected. My neighbors mocked me. They say I am a fool. I think they are right. My children will blame me. Vinoba looked at him a long time, the lantern light throwing deep shadows in the lines of his face. Do you regret the gift? He asked. The man hesitated. No, I regret my fear. Then complete the gift, Vinoba said quietly, and let your children see whether a house built on fear is safer than a house built on courage. Time will teach them which inheritance is stronger. Time, the one rival he could never debate, never persuade, never convert. By 1964, his body finally rebelled. Illness clamped down. His walking slowed, then stopped. He returned to Paunar, the ashram he had built like a quiet echo of Sabarmati, intending only to rest, a few months, perhaps a year, before taking to the road again. But India outside had changed. In Delhi, the old generation of freedom fighters was dying or fading. A new class of politicians and technocrats, many of whom had never known prison or Lathis, now spoke the language of 5-year plans and international loans. Land reform, that burning word of the 1950s, cooled into administrative files. The orator, now gray at the temples, had become a senior statesman, consulted, photographed, quoted. He no longer attacked Vinoba in public. He didn't need to. History itself, he felt, had judged between them. Nonviolent revolution, he told a foreign delegation once, was a noble dream, but in practice it has only softened the edge of injustice. Real change comes from policy, not pilgrimage. Far from the microphones, in the stillness of Paunar, Vinoba listened to such remarks carried to him by visitors and newspapers. They hurt. Of course they hurt. He was not a stone. He had given his youth to Gandhi, his prime to prison, his old age to the road. To be dismissed as a beautiful dream was a quiet crucifixion. And yet, each morning as the ashram bell rang and the sun edged over the low horizon, he rose, folded his shawl around his thinning shoulders and went to sit with the villagers who still came, on bicycles, on bullock carts, on foot, to ask him questions that no ministry could answer. How do I love a neighbor who cheated me? How do I teach my son not to drink when everyone in the village does? How do we live together when my caste cannot drink from their well? Sasti, land was only the visible crust of a much deeper problem, the ownership of power, of status, of dignity, and that battle, Vinoba knew, was nowhere near over. His health might have forced him to stop walking, but history was not done pulling at his sleeve. In a few years, a different storm would rise, this time not in a remote region, but in the very heart of the Republic, a crisis of democracy itself. Once again, the country would turn, bewildered, to its older moral figures asking, on which side are you? And once again, Vinoba Bhave would have to choose between the comfort of silence and the dangerous clarity of a stand that could wound both his reputation and his legacy forever. The storm, when it came, was not in the rice fields or the forests, but in the cities. among the concrete and the microphones. Students filled streets with hand-painted banners. Workers left factories in angry tides. Prices climbed, rumors swirled. Trust in the new republic drained away like water through a crack in the dam. In tea stalls and railway compartments, one word rose again and again, bitter and impatient: corruption. It was a different kind of violence now. Not the clean, brutal certainty of a gunshot, but the slow, sticky violence of bribes, rigged contracts, police looking the other way. For the young, it felt as if the dream of freedom had been exchanged for a shabby counterfeit. And whenever a country begins to doubt its own future, it looks backward, for elders, for prophets, for someone whose shadow is long enough to stand under. Two figures loomed in that anxious search. One was the orator, once a minister in crisp khadi, now increasingly restless with the very power he had helped shape. He began to speak again in the tones of his youth, of total revolution, of cleansing not just governments but values themselves. Crowds swelled to his call, their slogans sharp as flung stones. The other was Vinoba, thinner now, voice quieter, sitting on the mud floor of his ashram in Paunar, the world coming to him instead of the other way round. He spoke of inner revolution, of simplicity, of self-rule in the smallest of units, the village, the household, the heart. They were, in a sense, preaching to the same wound. But the remedies they prescribed were starting to diverge like forked rivers. Visitors came breathlessly from Delhi to Paunar, bearing political gossip like offerings. The government is under siege, Acharya. Strikes everywhere. Students in Gujarat brought down a ministry. Bihar is boiling. The orator is on the streets, calling for the prime minister to resign. They watched his face carefully, wanting to see which word would twitch at first. Prime minister, resign, or most dangerously, on the name of his old rival. He listened, head slightly bowed, fingers playing with the edge of his shawl. Power, he said finally, is like sugar. Sweet, but it rots the teeth. When teeth ache, people blame the dentist, not their own tongue. It sounded like a riddle, wise and harmless. But events outside were not harmless. One evening in June 1975, the long experiment of Indian democracy flickered. A court judgment shook the prime minister's legitimacy. Opposition parties scented triumph. Rallies swelled. Loudspeakers spat fire. Trains carried whisper and argument from one end of the country to the other. Then, overnight, the microphones went silent. The emergency was declared. Newspapers woke to find blank spaces where articles should have been. Opposition leaders were arrested before dawn, dragged from their beds, flung into crowded jails. The orator, who had spent years warning against the worship of the state, now found himself locked inside its iron embrace. In Bombay and Calcutta and Delhi, people read the headlines with a numb, stunned curiosity. Civil liberties suspended, censorship imposed, elections postponed. And then the question that traveled faster than any train: what will the saints say? What would the disciples of Gandhi, the men who had fasted under lathis, filled prisons, taught the nation the meaning of conscience, say now when their own freedom was being wrapped in barbed wire by a government that still swore on the Mahatma's name? A car rolled into Paunar one hot afternoon, its tires spitting gravel. Out stepped a senior official, face carefully composed in respectful concern. "Acharya," he said, bowing low, "the government is forced, in the national interest, to take strong steps. There is a conspiracy, foreign, internal, subversive. Undisciplined freedoms are tearing the country apart. The Prime Minister sends her respects. She asks for your blessings in this difficult hour." The ashram fell into a strange, suspended hush. All eyes turned to Vinoba. Images must have flickered in his mind. The young nation he had walked for till his feet bled, the fragile unity she had stitched, together out of castes and tongues and histories of hate, but also the arrogance of ministers, the lies of landlords, the failure of both law and love to truly uproot injustice. Disorder, too, was a kind of violence. Discipline, he had once told a gathering of students, is freedom arranged in lines. Now the state had drawn a very hard line. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, the decision was already on his tongue. "If this brings discipline to the country," he said slowly, "I welcome it. We have had too much talk of rights, too little talk of duties. Perhaps God has chosen this hour to teach us restraint." The words were soft. The explosion they caused was not. They shot out of Paunar like a flare. Vinoba blesses emergency. The headline ran in different languages, on different thicknesses of paper, but the shock behind it was the same. Some readers rubbed their eyes, certain it was misprint. The man who had once walked against guns now stood, it seemed, beside the government that had just put locks on the mouths of its critics. In jails where opposition leaders lay on thin mattresses, news of his support reached like a sour taste in already stale food. The orator, weakened by illness but still a lion in his chest, heard it and turned his face to the wall. "So," he murmured to a fellow prisoner, "the state finally found a saint it can live with." Outside, in university canteens and factory corners, the younger radicals, who had already mocked Putin as sentimental, now went further. "He is finished," they said flatly. "First he gave landlords a moral fig leaf, now he gives the government one. He calls this discipline. This is chains with clean labels." In Paunar, the criticism slashed through the ashram like an invisible whip. Some of his closest followers, men and women who had walked thousands of miles at his side, lay awake at night, staring at the dim ceiling. "Acharya," one of them ventured the next morning, voice shaking, "people say innocent men have been jailed. Newspapers cannot speak. If we bless all this, what becomes of Gandhi's satyagraha? What becomes of truth?" Vinoba listened, leaning on his stick. "I do not bless injustice," he answered. "I bless order. Anarchy is also violence. If the state misuses this power, it will answer to God and to the people. But if I condemn the emergency outright, those who crave chaos will use my words as a weapon. I cannot let my voice be a matchstick in dry grass." It was a reasoning born of fear, not personal fear, but a deep dread of India sliding into ungovernable fragments. Yet fear, even noble fear, can bend a straight line. In the villages, his prestige remained oddly untouched. Far from Delhi's arguments, small people thought in small, solid images. "The prime minister is like the father," an old farmer said. The orator shouts, the father slaps him. The saint says, "Children must behave." That is all. But in the cities, in the brittle, buzzing space where history gets written, a quiet trial was going on, and the jury was cruel. On one side, the orator, aging, kidneys failing, body racked, dragged from prison to prison, yet still the symbol of defiance, of civil liberties, of a republic's right to resist its own rulers. On the other, Vinoba, also old, also frail, but sitting in an ashram that the police did not touch, speaking words the censors did not black out. Once they had argued over whether justice came best through law or love. Now history had rewritten the scene into something harsher. Who stands with the people when the state itself becomes the landlord? The clock ticked louder for both of them. Doctors told the orator bluntly, "Your time is running out. Your kidneys are failing. If you want to see India free again, you have maybe a year, perhaps 2, no more." He smiled crookedly. "Then we must ask the people to hurry?" He called for nonviolent protest, for refusal to bow, for a movement not of stone-throwing youth alone, but of teachers and clerks and housewives. While he lay in and out of hospital beds, his call traveled like a candle passed from hand to hand. Posters with his gaunt face appeared on city walls. In those same months, Vinoba's health was sliding down its own slope. Walking was harder now. His hands shook when he wrote. But his mind remained sharp as flint. He could feel time tugging at his sleeve again, the same insistent pull he had known when he first set out into Telangana with nothing but faith and a walking stick. Then the countdown had been to prevent bloodshed. Now he felt another deadline, to finish saying what he needed to say about violence, about state power, about the crooked, complicated path between authority and freedom, before his own voice fell permanently silent. It was a race neither man could win. In early 1977, under pressure from within and without, the prime minister suddenly lifted the emergency and called for elections. It was a gamble, an act of bravado, or hubris. She believed the people would choose discipline over the memory of muffled voices. They did not. In a sweeping, almost stunned verdict, voters threw her government out. Men and women who had never attended a meeting, never shouted a slogan, walked quietly to polling booths and wrote their answer on little strips of paper. When the results rolled in, the country roared. Prison doors swung open. The orator, frailer than ever, stepped blinking into the sunlight, carried almost physically by the wave of gratitude and triumph that greeted him. He had no official post, no office. Yet for a brief crackling moment, he was the moral center of Indian politics. Ministers visited him instead of the other way around. Crowds fell silent when he raised a trembling hand. The same microphones that had once dismissed his warnings now feasted on his every syllable. Fame had simply jumped tracks. In Paunar, the radios crackled with the same news. Students who had once quoted Vinoba now quoted the orator. Young activists taped his photo above their desks next to Gandhi's. Some of Vinoba's followers watched this transfer of honor with a sour taste they tried to hide. He himself, when told of the results, only nodded. "The people have done their duty," he said. "Now let us see if the new rulers do theirs." But alone in the small cell that served as his room, something in him must have twisted. He had not asked for popularity. He had spent a lifetime trying to empty himself of ego. Yet to see the country's gratitude flow so overwhelmingly towards the man who had once been his fiercest critic, while his own blessing of the emergency was quoted as a cautionary tale, could not have been painless. The state that had ignored him when he walked now honored him. The president visited, committees invited his thoughts, universities offered degrees. The same state that had jailed the orator sought to wrap Vinoba gently in the silk of respectability. It was the most ironic of reconciliations. His old rival crowned by the people, himself embraced by the institutions he had distrusted. History, it seemed, liked its jokes elaborate. In his last years, he turned more and more away from that outside stage. If he could no longer walk across India's soil, he would walk across its scriptures. He began a massive, careful commentary on the Gita, speaking each evening to a small circle in Marathi, his words later transcribed as talks on the Gita. He reread the Upanishads, the Bible, the Quran, looking not for exotic differences but for the stubborn, repeated insistence on compassion and on restraint, on inner freedom. In Paunar, he experimented with the smallest possible unit of Gramdan, an ashram where no one owned anything personally, where decisions were made in circles, where women's voices could cut across age and status, where work was shared not by compulsion but by agreement. The site was almost embarrassingly modest. A few huts, a school where children chanted verses and then ran to weed the garden, a small hand-press printing pamphlets that almost nobody outside the movement would read, trees planted by hands that would never sit in Parliament. But it was, in its own stubborn way, a final answer to a lifelong question. If you do not trust the state, and you no longer trust the generosity of the powerful, what remains? Only this: a handful of people trying, here and now, to live the society they wish existed. He grew lighter in those years, as if the body itself were slowly backing out of the room. Sometimes he would sit for long stretches without speaking, eyes half closed, a faint smile on his lips, as if listening intently to a conversation just beyond the range of hearing. He stopped reading newspapers regularly. "They tell you when men fall," he joked once, "not when they stand up." Visitors still came, though fewer now. A new India was rising, of television, of consumer goods, of young men in synthetic shirts talking about engineering degrees and American visas. For them, the stories of padayatras and land gifts sounded like legends from a slower, dustier planet. Yet even they, when they walked into Paunar and saw the tiny bird-boned man sitting cross-legged on a woven mat, felt something loosen in their chest. They would find themselves talking not about their careers, but about their fathers, their childhoods, the small shames and angers they carried. He listened. That was his last great gift. Attention, unhurried, undivided. But time, which he had tried to stretch with walking and fasting and stubbornness, would not be fooled forever. In 1979, the orator died, his body finally surrendering after years of illness. The crowds at his funeral were oceanic. The tributes called him Lok Nayak, leader of the people. Commentators wrote solemnly that, with his passing, a certain kind of moral politics had ended. They were wrong by at least one man. Vinoba was 84. He felt the circle tightening, the list of mornings left beginning to shorten in his bones. In late 1982, after a series of illnesses, he made a decision that shocked even those who thought they knew the range of his austerities. He announced that he would no longer accept food or medicine. No dramatic slogans, no call to overthrow a law or shame a government. This was not a political fast in the Gandhian style, aimed at squeezing a concession from reluctant power. It was something starker. "My body," he told the ashram, "has done its work. I will not ask it to cling. Let it return to the earth with as little fuss as possible." In India, where fasting can be theater as well as prayer, the simplicity of it was unsettling. There was no crowd outside the gate, no battery of microphones. Only the slow procession of days, each one measured in sips of water, refused, in the careful watch of those who loved him. The news spread anyway, in the quiet, sideways way that such news always does. For some, cynicism rose first. So now he chooses death, a columnist wrote sharply. Did he choose silence when the Constitution was in danger? Others were gentler. Perhaps, an old comrade mused, he wishes to do with his life what he tried to do with land, return it as a gift with open hands. The doctors protested. The state sent messages of concern as if trying belatedly to save the conscience it had once so happily co-opted. Old friends came, some crying openly, some arguing fiercely at his bedside. The country still needs you, one insisted. At least eat enough to speak. He shook his head, lips cracking into a faint smile. Words, he whispered. I have scattered like seeds all my life. Now let silence speak. The ashram became a clock. Day 1. Day 2. Day 5. The skin drew tighter over his bones. The eyes, always luminous, even in age, seemed to grow larger, deeper, as flesh retreated from them. Children were kept away. The very birds outside seemed to lower their voices. On November 15, 1982, as the early winter light slipped through the gaps in the hut roof, his breath, which had been a fragile, stubborn thread through the night, stopped. No drum roll, no final thunderous statement, only a last exhalation that sounded to those gathered there, like a man unshouldering a load he had carried too far. He was 87. The state funeral, when it came, with its flags and gun salutes and awkward speeches, felt almost like an afterthought to those who had watched him disappear molecule by molecule over those last days. Months later, the government announced the highest civilian honor in his name, posthumous, polished, glittering in its formality. Bharat Ratna, the nation's jewel. It was a neat label for a life that had never been neat. If you stand today on India's highways and watch the trucks roar by carrying cement and steel, if you look at the glittering high-rises and the ragged clusters of huts in their shadow, you can say, with the cool certainty of statistics, that Vinoba failed. He did not end landlordism. He did not reinvent property. He did not stop corruption or prevent authoritarianism. Bhutan did not become the dominant mode of land reform. Gramdan did not rewrite the Constitution. His blessing of the emergency left a stain that no later award could wash out. But look closer. In some corner of Telangana, an old man still waters a mango tree on land his father received through Bhutan, a tree whose shade changed the trajectory of one family forever. In a village in Orissa, the descendants of those who agreed, half understandingly, to Gramdan still hold meetings where no voices allowed to shout another down because somewhere, long ago, a frail man in a cotton shawl told them that ours is a harder but nobler word than mine. In the hills of Maharashtra, a young activist fighting against displacement reads his talks on the Gita and finds, to his surprise, that spirituality does not always mean turning away from injustice, but sometimes turning more fiercely towards it, with less hatred. In courtrooms and on protest marches, the phrase land rights carries, under its hard legal edge, the faint echo of another, older phrase, land as gift. And somewhere in an air-conditioned office where experts debate policy, a junior officer quietly refuses a bribe, not because he fears the law, but because, as a boy, he once sat at the feet of an old man in an ashram who told him that the real ownership of anything is the freedom to give it up. Legacy is not a monument. It is a contagion of choices too small to track. Vinoba Bhave's story does not resolve neatly into victory or defeat. It sits uneasily between them, like a question that refuses both yes and no. Was he the conscience of a nation or its beautiful distraction? Did he soften injustice or shield it? Did he waste his life on a dream or prove that without such waste, a country loses its soul? The answer, if there is one, lies not in what happened in parliaments or palaces, but in the invisible arithmetic of hearts changed and not changed. He walked once into a war zone with nothing but a stick and a shawl, and convinced a man bred on power to tear 100 acres out of his own fist. He walked for decades at the unhurried speed of feet, stubbornly believing that the shortest distance between two human beings is not a law or a gun or a slogan, but a conversation. And in the end, when both his rival and his republic had taken their turns with fame and disgrace, he walked out of his own body with the same stubborn simplicity, turning even his death into a final experiment in freedom. In a century crowded with men who seized power, he remained the man who kept putting it down. That is harder to romanticize. It may also be harder to forget,